Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lance French, Director of Marketing for W&M Environmental, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar on tips for environmental reporting. Our speaker today is Heather Woodward. She is our Technical Director for W&M Environmental. Afternoon, Heather.
Good afternoon, Lance.
Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If we have any questions, please send them to me through your chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your question, I will make sure Heather sees it and we will get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording the webinars, and so it'll be available. It'll be available to watch later this afternoon, along with the slides that she's using today. So I will send you an email with that link when they're made available, hopefully around 2 o'clock. So that's enough out of me. Let's get to it. Heather, take it away.
Great, thanks, Lance. Let's see, next slide. There we go. This is going to be a very high-level presentation on common reporting things that you should know, common tips and common mistakes, but due to the interest of time, it's going to be hard to go in depth on any of these particular reports in an hour-long webinar. So it's going to cover kind of the high points, primarily covering regulatory applicability, when you need to report, due dates, and then common things that we see that should be included or common mistakes that we see people making in these reports. So again, it'll be very high level. Feel free to ask questions in the questions tab, and then if they're getting pretty detailed and pretty site specific, then we might table them, and then you and I can have a chat offline for your very specific questions. But feel free to post them out there, and then if we decide to take it offline, we'll go with that. So again, we're going to go ahead and get started, and the first tip in regulatory reporting is don't be late. There are no extensions to any of these deadlines. If you miss a deadline, you have a regulatory violation. Doesn't mean you shouldn't still go ahead and submit your report, but there's potential ramifications if you're late. So make sure you know what your dates are. In particular, know which ones are March 1st and which ones are March 31st. I always get these really confused. So I always have, W&M has some magnets, and if you would like a magnet that has all these reporting deadlines on it, and I just keep it posted in my office, because if somebody asks me when's the annual waste summary report due, I'll be like, oh, it's either March 1st or March 31st, let me go look. Well, it's due March 1st, so the annual waste summary and the Tier 2 reports are the first one on the hit parade, and they're both due March 1st. Then you have your stormwater multi-sector general permit, benchmark and DMR reports, and the air emissions inventory reports due March 31st. And then July 1st is the next big date, which is TRI. And if you have a pollution prevention plan, then your annual progress report would be also due July 1st. So those are the key dates. Make sure you know them. And like I said, we have magnets that are really nice and handy to post in your office so that you can always see when the dates are. And if you'd like one of those, we can certainly get you one. So the third tip, and it will be a common tip throughout the presentation, is knowing whether or not you even have to report. Rather than just jumping in and preparing a report, take a step back and just make sure that you trigger whatever the reporting threshold is. Annual waste summary, for the most part, nothing has changed from last year to this year, so it's pretty much as last year. You're probably still going to have to do it this year, assuming nothing changed with your manufacturing processes. But what triggers reporting for annual waste summary is if you're a small or large quantity generator, you're going to need to do an annual waste summary. If you generated greater than 2,000 pounds of a Class 1 non-hazardous waste, then you'd have to do an annual waste summary. If you stored more than 2,200 pounds of a hazardous waste or 2.2 pounds of an acutely hazardous waste, you'd have to report. Or if you generated or stored more than 220 pounds of acutely hazardous waste, spill cleanup material. So those are the first 4 key bullets. Now, one of the oxymorons of the annual waste summary is the no report required report. So there are a couple of things where triggers where you are over the first 4 bullets possibly, but or you qualify in the first 4 bullets, say you're a small or a large quantity generator, or you do a certain amount of Class 1 non-hazardous waste, then you've tripped the I need to do an annual waste summary report, but you don't generate very much of certain things, so then you can do the no report required. And so if you're a small quantity generator and you didn't meet any of the other 4 dots up there, then you can do a no report required annual waste summary. And then the other caveat is if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator but generated less than the 220 pounds of Class 1 non-hazardous waste in a given month and recycled all of this Class 1 non-hazardous waste during the report year, then you don't have to, you can do the no report required. And it's literally just a checkbox at the top that says, I don't have to do an annual waste report this year. And I think if you're doing the paper version, you would line it out, but in steers you would just check no report required and then move on. Again, it's kind of an oxymoron, but we do actually have clients that are just over the small quantity generator threshold, but they are actually in that no report required category. The big things that you're going to want to make sure you have are your waste manifests, and you would enter those into steers in the annual prep file. Not everybody has to use steers, but I highly recommend it. I think it's the most user-friendly way to do the annual waste summary, and so I would highly suggest that you get set up in steers if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator or small quantity generator. I would suggest you do it. If you're a large quantity generator, you have to use steers. And you enter your waste manifests and the shipping records into what's called the annual prep file, and then at the end of the year you would have an annual end of the year inventory that you'd have to do, and prior year's annual waste summary reports. That's some stuff that you're going to want to gather because you're going to need to use that in a formula I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And sometimes your waste broker or hauler will offer annual summary reports. These are good for a cross-check to make sure you've got all your manifests and that your weights cross-check with theirs, but it's not the legal document for your reports. It's the manifests that are. So it will be a helpful starting point and a good check, but it's not what you can base your whole report on. So just make sure that you realize that. Some things that you don't have to include in your annual waste summary are things like universal waste. They don't have to be reported. Used oil or oil filters that are recycled don't have to be reported. Class 1 non-hazardous waste that is recycled does not have to be reported. And if you're a non-industrial generator, then you don't have to include your non-hazardous waste at all, regardless of whether they're recycled or not. And if you don't know if you're an industrial versus a non-industrial generator, if you look at the annual waste summary instructions and Appendix D, it can give you some guidance on whether or not you're an industrial or a non-industrial generator. So a non-industrial generator has to report all their hazardous waste, but not necessarily their non-hazardous waste. Industrial generators will have to do their Class 1 non-hazardous waste if it was sent off for disposal or landfill or incineration or some other thing as opposed to being recycled. Certain wastewaters can also be excluded. It's a really fairly long definition, so I'm not going to go into the details here, but if you have wastewaters that you generate, you can refer to Appendix B of the instructions, and maybe some of those wastewaters that you generate don't have to be reported. So one of the common things that we see generators not getting correct in their annual waste summary is the total quantity generated of the annual waste summary report. Most people seem to think that the total quantity generated is what I shipped out, but that's really not the formula, and that's not how it goes. The first thing is, the amount you shipped off during the year has to go in the report, and it's part of the total quantity generated. But also at the end of each year, you're supposed to do a year-end inventory by December 31st. So you have to do a year-end inventory, and this is actually a legal requirement to do the year-end inventory, and it's found in 30 Texas Administrative Code 335.9. So you have to do that year-end inventory, and whatever you have in your year-end inventory counts towards what you generated during that calendar year. And then assuming you did the year-end inventory from the prior report year, then you subtract out whatever you had stored on site at the end of the prior year. So that's the formula for total quantity generated. So the assumption is whatever you had on site at the end of the prior year is part of that amount shipped during the report year, so you subtract that back out, and then you add back in the amount stored at the end of the report year. I know a lot of people kind of hand wave and go, oh, we always have about the same amount on site at the end of any year, so we're just assuming that balances out. And technically that's not how you can do this report, so just make sure you're following this, especially because there actually is a code that says you have to do a year-end inventory. Another common reporting tip / mistake that can occur is for class 1 non-hazardous waste, and again this is for industrial generators, you do not include the portion that has been recycled, but you do include any portion that you may have stored at the end of the year waiting to be recycled. You have to add that as a line item on your annual waste summary. Or if any other class 1 non-hazardous waste that got shipped off for disposal purposes as opposed to recycling, those would also need to be included. So make sure, even though you may have a class 1 non-hazardous waste that you send off for recycling, if it was stored at your site at the end of the year, you have to include that in your annual waste summary report. So again, the key to getting any regulatory report done on time is getting started and getting ahead of the power curve and doing it early. Don't delay, especially if you're a large quantity generator and you ship a lot of waste. You really need to be entering those manifests into the STEER's annual prep file throughout the year, because otherwise you're going to be spending days at the last minute trying to do data entry. I'd also recommend that you have somebody else cross-check and double-check your data entry. If you've got someone else that can offer that QA function for you, it would help make sure that you don't have mistakes in your data entry process. Some common mistakes, again, that we see is that people don't put in a line item on their annual waste summary report showing what was stored on site at the end of the year. And the way you would do that is say, you know, I have 200 pounds of this waste code on site and it's stored in my waste management unit 001. So for the facility ID that would go to, it would be 001, and your handling code would be 141 to show it was still stored on site. So make sure that you are adding those line items in on the report. And again, something that I already harped on is the total quantity generator does not always equal the total quantity shipped. So, and then tip number 4 is read the instructions. These annual waste instructions aren't actually all that long, so they're pretty user-friendly and pretty quick to read. And it's a good refresher. I know we've all been doing annual waste summaries for a really long time, so we think we've got it all down pat, but it doesn't hurt to go back and reread some of these instructions just to make sure you've got it right.
Heather, did you want to launch the first poll right now?
Yep, please.
Okay, so did you know that you were supposed to report waste store on site at the end of the year? Yes or no? We'll give you a couple minutes to open that up.
And while you're answering the poll question and we're waiting on that, if you have any other questions, feel free to populate those and we'll take those too.
Okay, I think that's enough time. So just there we go. Just now they're closed. Okay.
There we are.
Sorry about that.
Yay! 59% said that they know that they had to do the reporting the annual waste at the end of the year. So that's good. That's good. The other 41% of you, I'm glad you have learned something new today already.
And we do have a question from the audience, Heather. So for a CESQG, Is the no report all we need to do, or do we need to submit our waste information?
That depends on what you do. If you're, sorry, go back a slide here. That would depend on whether or not you generate a certain amount of Class 1 non-hazardous waste. There's that trip at the beginning, the slides I had at the very beginning, that talk about if you generated a certain amount of Class 1 non-hazardous waste and you did not send that waste off for recycling, then yes, you may still need to report an annual waste summary. It just depends on what you did with your Class 1 non-hazardous waste. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, feel free to, my contact information will be available at the end. Feel free to holler at me directly if you want to talk about more specifics. Okay, so we'll move on to Tier 2 reporting, which is the next March 1st due date report. And this report is geared towards emergency responders, making sure emergency responders have an idea of the total amount of chemicals you're going to have at your site, or the amount of chemicals you're going to have at your site in an emergency situation. So the Tier 2 report gets submitted to the TCEQ and then also to the local emergency planning committee and the local fire department. So the local fire department, in theory, is using this to know what hazards they'd face if they come. You give a 911 call, I have a fire at my plant. This will be information so that they'll know what kind of chemical hazards they could potentially be facing when they come out to your facility. The local emergency planning committee, they use it to plan regionally for regional disasters like hurricanes or tornadoes, so that they know how to respond and where their high-risk areas might be from a chemical hazard perspective during a regional incident. So, and then TCEQ manages the program overall, and they may have other plans and things that they do with it as well. So, and I think most everybody is aware that the TCEQ took over the program for last report year, which was report year 2015, and it moved from the Texas Department of State Health Services over to the TCEQ as of last year, and so this will be the second report year for the TCEQ. So again, do you have to report? And I would recommend that you do this inventory every year and make sure that you've walked your facility and double check your inventory of hazardous chemicals. Don't just take last year's report and resubmit it, because your chemical inventory could have changed, and it's always a good refresher to make sure you as an EHS professional knows what you have at your plant. And hopefully you're pretty familiar with that anyways, but it's a good refresher to see what's out there and what might have been snuck in behind your backs. Not that that happens at other places, but I've seen it. So anyways, you have to report if you have more than 10,000 pounds of a hazardous chemical, or if you have more than the threshold planning quantity, or 500 pounds, whichever is less, of an extremely hazardous substance. And we have the hot link to the EHS list here. And if it was on site for any one day during the report year for the past year. So it kind of seems a little bit strange that firefighters would, you know, if you had something on site, say for a week last year because you had, you know, a specific project going on, say a construction project or something, and you had more than 10,000 pounds of something on your site as a result of this construction project, and then it was gone. It seems kind of strange, but that's the requirement, and that's what you do. And how you would make a notice of that is when you're reporting for that chemical, you need to make sure that one of the form fields that you have to fill out is how many days on site was this chemical. Make sure that's right. Don't just automatically populate in the 365, because it could be that it was only on site for, you know, 5 or 10 days, and you need to just make sure that that's where you record how many days on site it is. And I think there's also a comment field that if you wanted to say, yeah, it's no longer there, then you can add that to the comment section too. And so an example of the threshold planning quantity versus the 500 pounds would be something like sulfuric acid is an extremely hazardous substance, but its TPQ is more than 500 pounds, so then you would use the 500 pounds, whereas something like hydrofluoric acid its TPQ is 100 pounds, so then you would use 100 pounds for your threshold for if you have hydrofluoric acid on your site. And again, a hazardous chemical is defined by OSHA. Reporting of mixtures. So this is something that is new to my slides this year, and it's not new to the rules, but it's one of those things that you might need to go off and make sure that you're reporting your mixtures correctly. So you may have a bunch of trade name chemicals that are a mixture of various chemistries, and if you have an extremely hazardous substance within that mixture, you need to aggregate that mixture, that EHS, across the site and see if you went over that threshold. So an example would be if you had 3 different trade name chemicals and they all had, say, 50 pounds of hydrofluoric acid. Each trade name chemical may not exceed the 100 pounds, but aggregating those 3, you're at 150 pounds, so you'd have to report for your hydrofluoric acid. And you can either report based on the mixture, so by that meaning the trade name, or you can report based on the hydrofluoric acid. For EHSs, I'd report on the chemistry itself, except for batteries, and we'll talk about batteries in a little bit. And this same mixture rule applies to non-EHS chemicals. You'd still have to do that threshold calculation, but now your threshold is 10,000 pounds. So in general, it's pretty hard to exceed that 10,000 pounds for a particular chemistry within a mixture. And again, it's the percent concentration base. So if you have a mixture and you've only got 5%, say, of hydrochloric acid in it, then the weight percent of that hydrochloric acid is only that 5% of the total weight of your trade name chemical. So you would aggregate the actual hydrochloric acid concentration across the board, and if that exceeded 10,000 pounds, then you would report hydrochloric acid either in the trade name or in the chemical name. Just be consistent. So that's what this slide kind of means. It's not the most user-friendly of regs, but reporting mixtures, and in general, like I said, mixture reporting isn't super common for non-EHS chemicals because it's really hard to exceed that 10,000 pounds without busting the 10,000 pounds for a specific mixture, because usually then you got more than a certain mixture of that a certain trade name chemical over 10,000 pounds. So it's not super common. I haven't seen it personally, but anyways, so hopefully that was clear. If it's not, shoot me a question or we can talk about it more later. Common reporting exemptions that are out there, there's actually quite a list of them, and there's the link at the bottom of this page for them. The most common exemption is whether or not it's a hazardous chemical or a hazardous substance, and the way you would be able to know this is if the SDS or MSDS clearly states it's not a hazardous chemical and or not reportable under Section 311 and 312 of EPCRA, then you don't have to report it. So if your SDS clearly states it's not a hazardous chemical, then you're good. That's the first way out, and that ties back to the whole OSHA definition. If it's a hazardous waste or a radioactive waste, you don't report it. Anything regulated by the Food and Drug Administration as far as foods, food additives, colors, color additives, cosmetics, if it's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, then it's not reportable under Tier 2. If it's a solid in any manufactured item, and to the extent that the substance does not exposure to the substance doesn't occur under normal conditions of use, then the solid is not reportable, or if it's an article and that's based on its function. So in a lot of cases, things like metal rod is not reportable because it's a solid, or if it's already shaped into an article, then it's not required. So again, you can find all these exemptions on the TCEQ website. There's key changes that have occurred, and I talked about this a little bit last year for what they're doing, and then I'll talk about some of what we've seen over the past year now that TCEQ has taken over the program. Again, right now we're still using the Tier 2 submit software Eventually they want to migrate it to a steers program, but for now everything is still on the Tier 2 Submit software, so you're going to need to go out and download Tier 2 Submit onto your hard drive. That's where it gets downloaded. So if you don't have administrative rights to download software to your computer, make sure you get with your IT people and get that downloaded quickly, because you don't want to miss your deadline for submitting because you're still working your way through even just getting the software onto your computer. Eventually it'll go steers, but it's not there yet. The other big thing that they are now requiring in the Tier 2 submission software is the RN and the CN numbers and your TXT2 numbers. So the RN and the CN, hopefully you have some, but there are a few places that may have a CN but they don't have an RN for a particular site or location. So start early in making sure you have your regulated entity numbers and your customer numbers in place and put them in. However, if you don't have an RN or a CN, don't not submit your report. Still submit it by March 1st, leaving those fields blank. They'll be in your state fields. You can submit it, leave them blank, and then the TCEQ will come back and ask you for that data, but they're going to expect to see that data this year. And if you already have it, great, it's easy to populate in, even though, again, in the Tier 2 Submit software, if you guys are at all familiar with it, they have boxes that have red asterisks that are mandatory fields. The RN and CN do not have the red asterisk, but they're going to expect to see it this year, so just make sure you get it turned in. But don't hold back submission based on these two numbers if you don't happen to have them. The big thing that we saw over the course of last year after submitting the Tier 2 reports is that the TCEQ has thrown a lot more reviewers at the reports and are doing a much more fine-tooth comb review of the data that's been submitted. And one of the biggest things they're kicking back and asking for additional requests for data on is the storage locations. They want to make sure that you are accurately describing where it is in a way that an emergency responder could find it on your site. So if you're using, say, something that says, I've got a liquid nitrogen tank on the north side of my maintenance building, then you're going to need to attach a site map that shows where the maintenance building is. And so they like to see site maps, but they don't say that it needs to be something detailed with all your process lines and equipment. It can be something like a Google Earth image with notes on the image saying, you know, here's where this is, here's where that is, my maintenance building is here, so that an emergency responder, or if you have a plot plan or some other, you know, just site layout that is kind of a, you know, a top-down, high-level, and you can use that as directions, that's great. You can submit that. Or something else you could do if you don't want to attach a site map is say, this is located on the northeast corner of the property or in the center of the property. But if you're starting to reference buildings, then you probably need to have a map so that somebody coming in from the outside knows which building is which. So those are some things that really got kicked back a lot last year. The other thing that came out in the Tier 2 training class that I attended a couple of weeks ago is they were not giving delivery or not sending out confirmation emails last year. This year they'll send out one confirmation email per email submitter. So if you have more than one site, the first time you submit your Tier 2 report, you'll get a confirmation email back from the TCEQ saying, we got it. But if you have more than one submission, you're not going to keep getting extra confirmation emails. You're only going to get it once per email address. So with that said, it's still a good idea to get either a delivery and or a read receipt from when you submit the Tier 2 report so that you can show that it did get submitted. Ultimately, the responsibility is just to make sure that you have your documentation showing that you submitted it. So if you have your email showing that it was submitted, that's what you need to keep in your files, but it doesn't hurt to at least get a delivery confirmation as well. Data you're going to need, things like your material safety data sheets or your safety data sheets and the chemical inventory. Those are the biggest data collection things. The TXT2 numbers are actually a corporate number, so it's kind of like a CN number only for Tier 2 in particular. So, and then you can have one corporate number and multiple facilities under that number, and then you can do consolidated filing fees. So that'll help reduce costs a little bit if you have multiple sites. They're still going to have you email the Tier 2 submit software file, the T2S file, to the TCEQ, and depending on the local emergency planning committee may want only the T2S file, but some may want both the T2S file and the PDF, so double check. The LEPC list will tell you how they want to see the data. And then for your local fire department, just see how they want it submitted. You know, some are fine with the T2S files, some are okay with emailing a PDF, and some still want you to mail the hard copy. So each local fire department may have their own thing. Common mistakes that we see really is this whole lead acid batteries. They're not exempted as articles, and because they aren't exempted, there can be a pretty quick trigger because sulfuric acid is an extremely hazardous substance and with a 500-pound reporting threshold. So the places that you'll commonly see large amounts of sulfuric acid, lead acid batteries are electric forklifts or electric material handlers or buggies or whatever. So if they use the big batteries, then you're going to find that weight adds up in a hurry. And then also a lot of buildings, especially for computer systems, will use building uninterrupted power systems, UPS systems. It's battery strings in case of a power outage that is apparently softer or gentler on computer systems. So a lot of buildings will have these battery strings, and they'll add up in a hurry. So just make sure that you check your battery weights, and then there's a battery FAQ that is pretty helpful in knowing how to report for your batteries and how to estimate how much sulfuric acid you will have in your batteries to see if you've exceeded the 10,000 pound or the 500-pound limit for sulfuric acid. If you have more than 10,000 pounds of lead acid batteries, by default you're going to have more than 500 pounds of the sulfuric acid, so that means you're going to have two separate line items on your Tier 2 report. You're going to have one line item for the 10,000 pounds of lead acid batteries and another line item for your sulfuric acid. And that's the current direction. TCEQ is wanting to see that report. However, if you have, say, 8,000 pounds of lead acid batteries, but you exceed the 500 pounds of sulfuric acid, you would only report the sulfuric acid, not the lead acid batteries too. So that's kind of a common thing that people miss, is this whole idea that a battery is not an article. Again, here's some resources. I'm not going to read through these that are available. So are there any questions? And I think there's another poll question, right, Lance?
Yes, there is. Do you think that Tier 2 reports are actually used by the emergency planning authorities? We'll give you a couple minutes to answer that. When I mean couple, I mean one. Heather, do you see the results?
Yes, I do, and it looks like 86% of you think that the local planning committees, local responders like your fire department or your LEPCs actually use the data, and 14% don't. So that's interesting. And I'm sure that depends on what region you're in. I'm sure some fire marshals and fire departments are more interested in this than some maybe volunteer fire departments. But okay, so we'll move on to stormwater and benchmark, stormwater benchmark and discharge monitoring reports. So this is the next on the hit parade. the end of March, March 31st. And again, you have to report if you have a current TXR 05 50,000 stormwater, the MSGP permit. And it got renewed last year. And so there are some changes associated with that permit renewal and the changes that got made in the permit during that 5-year cycle. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those and how they affected reporting. So you have to report if you have that kind of permit. And for benchmark monitoring reporting, if you have sector-specific benchmarks. Some sectors have to pull benchmark samples, other sectors do not. So depending on your sector, you may have a benchmark reporting requirement. And some sectors have their own specific numeric effluent limits, and some sectors don't. But all permittees have the annual metals discharge monitoring report or annual metals sampling requirement unless you have filed for the hazardous metal waiver. So pretty much everybody's going to have to do a discharge monitoring report unless you've filed the waiver. So for the benchmark report, again, it depends on whether or not it applies to your sector. If it does, then you're going to have semi-annual sampling. One sample needs to be collected in the period of January through June, the second sample between July and December. And the report is a paper report still this year, and it's the average from January to June, and then the average from July to December, and then your annual average. It's a pretty simple, straightforward report. The average is across the site, and it's not, this report is not done on an outfall by outfall basis, but really it's an average across the site for each of those 3 cycles, 3 time frames. And if you did not sample, then you still have to submit the report, but you'll just state for each period. So sometimes you may have not been able to grab a sample, say from January to June, because there wasn't rain or something in your area. And so you would put no sample or no discharge in that column, and then you would do it for the one you got. So just be sure to fill in, even if you never got a sample the whole year, you still need to submit the report stating that you didn't get a discharge sample. However, if you didn't get a sample for some reason during a reporting period, you need to make sure that you're keeping up with your rain gauge log to be able to document and demonstrate that you didn't have a qualifying rain event, so that you don't get a violation for not grabbing a sample. But if you had a whole bunch of rain in your area and you just never got a sample, then you could potentially be in trouble for not collecting your sample. But make sure you're keeping up with your rain gauge log. For the discharge monitoring report, again, this is an annual sampling requirement. It may be more frequently depending on it's annual requirement for the metals monitoring, and then annual sector specific, or possibly more depending on your sector. You'll have to look at your sector specific monitoring requirements. But this report is due annually by March 31st, and the Sector S just had numeric effluent limits added to their permit this past permit cycle, which means that because the permit cycle was like the middle of the last quarter, you didn't have to grab that sample last year, which would be 2016, but you'll have to grab a sample sometime in 2017, and so your first report year will be 2018 for Sector S. But for all the others, A, C, D, E, J, and O, you have your annual requirement still by March 31st this year. The permit specifically says that effective December 21st, 2016, you had to start doing electronic reporting using NetDMR, and it was a little confusing in the report because for the annual hazardous metals discharge monitoring report, you only have to turn it in if you had an exceedance or a violation of your metals limit. But if everything meets your metals limit, then all you have to do is retain the discharge monitoring report in your stormwater plan records. So if you don't have to submit to the TCQ, you can still use the paper form to do the annual metals discharge monitoring report. And that will apply for all 5 years if you don't have an exceedance. But if you wind up having an exceedance, then you're going to need to use the NetDMR for electronic reporting. I've got a caveat on that coming for this year, but I'll talk about that in a minute. If you have sector-specific DMR requirements, then you have to use net DMR and submit every year regardless. So things you're going to need obviously are your analytical reports from the samples that you collected, any sector-specific benchmark lab reports, and any site-specific stormwater monitoring reporting paperwork. Like some sectors have, say, pH requirements that they have to sample for, and those would be done at the site as opposed to sent off to a lab. So if you have benchmark, some sectors, like we have some scrap yards that we deal with, those scrap yards have benchmark requirements in the annual metals monitoring, in their benchmark monitoring requirements for things that are also in the hazardous metals list. For example, they have copper as one of their benchmark parameters. So that means that they're going to have benchmark, they're sampling twice per year for the benchmark, and one of those will count towards the annual hazardous metals, but both have to get reported on your discharge monitoring report. So you'll have to include, anytime you grab a sample, those are all those samples have to be reported. You can't pick and choose. You'll have to keep your monitoring reports on site for 3 years, and the benchmark results are averaged across all outfalls. I talked about that a minute ago, and the benchmark average results for the year are compared against the benchmark level, not the individual results. So it's the average across the site, not the individual results, that get compared against the benchmark level. And one of the tips is get set up on NetDMR now, but I put that in last night, and then as of like 15 minutes before the webinar, I got some email correspondence back because I'd heard that maybe NetDMR isn't set up for the MSGP, and it's not yet. So I got an email from the TCEQ that said that the TCEQ is transitioning from Texas NetDMR system to EPA's NetDMR system by June of 2017. And after that transition, the MSGP permittees will be able to submit electronically. So because the reporting due date is March 31st, everybody's going to be allowed to submit a paper copy for RY 2016. So by March 31st, 2017, be sure you submit your paper copy just like you had been doing in prior years, assuming you had a violation. If you didn't have a violation, if it's a metals monitoring, you don't have to submit it. If your sector is required, then you need to get it submitted paper-wise by March 31st. And so the temporary waiver for doing the paper version will expire on August 31st, 2017. So you'll need to be sure to get your NetDMR set up later this year. But so that's just hot off the presses. Again, common mistakes, make sure you check the units on your lab report. Sometimes they're in micrograms per liter and may need to be converted to milligrams per liter. For discharge monitoring reports, one of the other common mistakes we see clients make is that they think DMR is completed for each outfall, but it's not. It's completed for the site as a whole. So if you have multiple outfalls at your site, let's say you have 4 outfalls and you're part of the scrap yards I talked about, and they have copper, so they have 2 samples per year requirement. So let's say they have 4 outfalls and they have 2 benchmark requirements. That means they have 8 samples or 8 sample results in a given year. So in the discharge monitoring report, you would say that your sample frequency was 8, and then the value you put in as your copper level is whatever your highest copper level was of those 8 samples. So that's how you would fill out the discharge monitoring report. Again, it's not on per outfall, it's per site, the whole MSGP permitted area. So make sure that's a common one we've seen being made by companies, as they think it's outfall per outfall. So again, we have resources that are available. I don't believe we have a poll question after this one, do we, Lance?
We do not. I can
Okay.
make up one if we want, but other than that, we're good.
Nah, we're good. We'll just keep moving on unless there are questions. Were there any questions?
No, ma'am, not yet.
So we'll move on to emissions inventory, and I'm going to skim through this relatively quickly because we actually are running short on time, and we already had a webinar last Thursday. WNM put on a webinar for the emissions inventory, so I will have the link if you want to watch the recording of that. So again, the first question is, do I have to report? The biggest change here in the do I have to report, the triggers haven't changed except for the lead at half a ton per year. That is a new reporting threshold trigger. So make sure if you have lead emissions that you're calculating those and determine whether or not you have to report. And the other big trigger for reporting or clarification that came out this year is that the TCEQ further clarified that greenhouse gases are excluded from the applicability determination for reporting. So this doesn't include greenhouse gases. So that's the two big changes from last year to this year. Things you're going to want to have, and again, this one there's a lot more potential data that you're going to need. You're going to need your SDSs possibly. If you've done stack tests or monitoring data, you're going to need that. Production, chemical usage, and throughput, any of your equipment and pollution control device specifications, any emission factors that you're using. And most of these things should be set up already, but you need to make sure that those types of data are being collected. A complete emissions inventory includes the submission, which has to be done via STEERS. No more paper copies are accepted. And then you submit your data through STEERS, but then you have to attach or send them sample calculations, any summary test results for your stack test data, any of your accuracy, relative accuracy test audit sheets, assigned certification statements. And one of the new things this year in the certification statement is if you had no emission events, you have to actually certify saying, I did not have any emission events. So that's a new thing this year. And if you have confidential information, that will not be submitted as an attachment or as an upload or an email. You have to snail mail any confidential information to the TCEQ and make sure that you mark each page as confidential or each diskette. One of the big things and the hardest things about the emission inventory is making sure you get your structure set up correctly and accurately, and that you've identified your facilities, your control devices, and your emission points accurately and how they're all tied together and where they're located at your facility. That is probably the hardest thing, and then you make sure that's done and done right, and before you save it in STEERS, make sure it's done and done right, because once it's in STEERS, it's really hard to change. You can do some collective sources for some of the smaller emissions, and the only caveat is that you have to have the same source classification code for those similar emissions. So collective sources can help us. You have a bunch of little things that can be added together. And then you'll also include your maintenance, startup, and shutdown operations. The routine things are included. You don't include your emission events, but you're going to have that certification. As I said, if you don't have any emission events, you submit those separately. And if you had none, then you would. I didn't do that very well. So in your MSS emissions are reported routinely in your emissions inventory. The emission events, which are non-authorized, those have a separate column, and they have a separate report, and that will need to be reported. And again, this year, if you had no emission events, then you're going to have to send something in and certify I had no emission events. Speciating of chemicals, this is definitely something where you need to know the speciation requirements based on your geographic location. and you need to select the most accurate contamination code. I talked about the confidential information already, so make sure you're speciating your chemicals right. Ozone season, again, this isn't new. It's been around for several years that they changed the formula to be 153 days per year as your denominator, as opposed to, a different calculation. So that formula has been around for a few years, so I don't think anything's really changed there. It's just kind of a reminder, a refresher that that's the formula. So again, the big tip, the RG360 is a really good publication that helps walk you through the process, so it's really good guidance to read the instructions and read that guidance document. There's some links here. Unfortunately, yesterday was the day that the TCEQ had their workshop, so you missed it, but keep a lookout for January of next year. But the good news is, even though you may have missed our webinar that happened on January 19th, you can still view the recording and download the slides, and the link is here in case you want to do that. So if you have any questions on emissions inventories, I know that's an extremely, not even 40,000 foot, maybe 100,000 foot detail on emissions inventories. If you have specific questions or need help, holler at me, or if you watched the EI webinar that happened last week, there are 3 different experts on that panel that had that webinar, and you can contact any of them as well. So we'll hop right on into TRI, which is the next bigger bugaboo, which is due July 1st. So most people get through March 31st and all those reports, and then they take a big breath and they start on their TRI. And quite honestly, if you start on your TRI in April, that's still kind of pushing the limit, because TRI takes a fair amount of time to get done. It's based on whether or not you have a facility's NAICS codes, the trigger, so make sure you know what your North American Industrial Classification, I'm not sure I have that acronym right, but anyways, the NAICS code, make sure you know what your NAICS code is for all your sites and whether or not it's on the list. So that's step 1 of, do I have to report? Know that. And then, does the facility have more than 10 full-time employees, which equates to 20,000 hours, and there's a big long definition with math formulas on how you would justify the 20,000 hours or less. So make sure you go and look at that. If you think you're bumping that 10 full-time employee threshold, go off and do those calculations, because if you're less than 10 full-time employees, then you don't have to report either at that particular site. And then the last thing is, make sure you really understand the definitions of manufacture, process, and otherwise use, because you have to report if you exceed those thresholds. So the typical threshold for manufacture and process is 25,000 pounds. For otherwise use, it's 10,000 pounds, so make sure you know what the difference is between manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using a TRI reportable chemical. Again, the TRI reportable chemicals is a list of chemicals, and it's 650-ish plus or minus chemicals, and if you use those chemicals at your site, then depending on how much you use, you may need to report. But again, check the first 2 bullets here, and then if you say, yep, I'm in the right NAICS code and I definitely have more than 10 full-time employees, then you're going to have to go through and do your reporting threshold determination. So this is a flow chart, and again, the big thing with this report is document, document, document. You need to make sure you have all your documentation in a row. So this is just a flow chart, says the same thing that I just said. It's just presented in a different layout. The question is, do I have to report? Again, the first question is, so the Tier 2 report is somewhat different than the others, which is, if I meet these thresholds, I automatically have to report, whereas Tier 2, TRI, is 2 distinct steps, and each step has to be done and each step has to be documented. Well, step 1 has to be done and has to be documented, and that is to do your threshold determination. So basically, you start at step 1 here after you've said, yep, I'm in the right NAICS code columns, I'm triggered there, and I have more than 10 employees. So now I have to go see if I've manufactured, processed, or otherwise used a TRI listed chemical in excess of its reporting threshold. And if the answer to that is yes, then you go on and complete your forms. So don't just jump in and start preparing Form R reports for a chemical. It may be on the list, but if you only, if it's a non-persistent bioaccumulative toxin and you only used 5,000 pounds of it, then you don't have to do your Form R. So don't start just jumping in and preparing your Form Rs. Make sure you do this threshold determination to make sure you even have to report at all. And if you don't have to report, then it's very important to make sure you have documentation showing you didn't have to report. A lot of times we'll run across clients and they'll say, oh yeah, TRI, oh no, I don't exceed anything. And you're like, okay, great, good. Where's your documentation showing you don't? And it's like, oh no, we just kind of know we don't ever have to report. And it's like, oh, that's not going to fly with the EPA. Come on, let's put pen to paper and have documentation in our files, because the regulators just won't buy into that hand wave. So make sure that if you don't have to report, that's great. And if you don't have to report for last report year, then you still have to do these calculations for this year's report year. And you have to do it every year. You can't just say, oh, 5 years ago we did it and we're still good. So you have to do it every year. If for some reason then you trip a threshold, then you have to do your Form R or your Form A, depending on what you have. And that step is where you start going in and figuring out what your releases were to air, water, waste, and you put that into your Tri-Me web and you prepare your Form R, Form A. So the first step is your threshold determination. Again, this is a flow chart, says the same thing I just talked about. And this next step is your release determinations. So again, threshold determinations, make sure you know what your chemicals are, and make sure you know what your production, chemical usage, and or throughput data is for the year. The more accurate you can be with your actual throughput or usage, the better off you are. Sometimes you just have to do it based on purchasing records, which is probably the least good, but it's better than nothing. Then once you say, yep, I tripped a threshold, then the things you're going to need to do your Form R or your Form A is things like your manifest for your off-site shipments, your emissions inventory. If you have to do one, then that's really easy to populate your air emissions data, hopefully, into your TRI. Or if you don't have an EI, then you're going to have to do your air emission estimates for chemicals, your stormwater discharge monitoring reports or wastewater discharge monitoring reports, or other records to show what your off-site releases were. So again, I know the PRI instructions are like an inch thick, printed double-sided. They're huge, but really it's important to read the instructions, at least the first part of applicability, manufacture, process, otherwise use, really understand those definitions and really understand the exemptions that are out there. They have quite a few outs for chemicals, so make sure you read through these and understand what the potential outs are, like the de minimis levels or the article exemption. So another big one is the maintenance and janitorial supplies and structural facility ground maintenance. Those chemicals are excluded, so that can be a big exclusion. So make sure you know what your exemptions are, and those are all in the instructions, and it's really important to read through that. One of the big documentation things that comes out, and this applies to all the reports that I've just talked about, is to name your files with an RY designation, meaning report year. So that way, if you look at a file and say it's 2015 TRI, you don't know if that was done in 2015 for report year 2014 or if that was report year 2015. So to clarify everything, just make sure you use the RY designation. So anything you're doing now in 2017, label the files RY 2016. So you know it was for last year's report year, even though the work was done in 2017. That's a really big one. Make sure you have good records and you can use those records over and over. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you know what your emission factor is, unless something's changed, or if you have some guidance document that says here's how you can do this, make sure that keep that year over year. Don't keep reinventing that wheel. Just make sure that you do verify that those assumptions you've made are still valid. Keep records of everything and how you made all your basis of calculations, any of your analytical data, your emission factors. And let's say it was something that you came up with 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Make sure you carry that record through to each report year's data file, so that if you purge 10-year-old records as part of your records management program, that you don't lose whatever it was that you were using as your basis of estimate. Make sure you carry that along with you. Records are required for 3 years, but the statute of limitations is 5, and I know that the EPA Region 6 is really big on the 5-year thing. Another big thing to think about is not applicable versus 0. Because a lot of times you can have a checkbox that says, no, this isn't applicable to my site. Not applicable means it's not possible at your site, whereas 0 means it's possible, but no release occurred, or a release of less than half a pound for non-PBTs. So there's a difference there, and the EPA expects to see that distinction. Data precision, again, some of these estimates can be pretty rough and pretty high level. So if you're using a pretty rough estimate, you can't go down to 10 decimals in your math. I mean, your Excel spreadsheet may be able to go to 10 decimal places, but really you only need to go to 2 significant digits as far as EPA is concerned. And when possible, use the range codes. That gives you a lot more flexibility in case you had a slight math error, then your range code is probably still accurate. So again, you just make sure that whatever you're using as your basis of estimate is as accurate as possible, but some of them can wind up being fairly rough. So again, here's some resources, and again, keep a lookout. EPA Region 6 usually has annual training. I think last year it was just web-based and not web-based in modules, and it was not live in-person ones, but keep an eye out for those. I think they email everybody. So that was it for TRI. And was there a poll question after TRI, Lance?
There was, but since we're running a little low on time, I think we'll skip it, if that's okay.
Okay. Yep, that works for me. Annual progress report for P2 is really quick. Basically, if you're a large quantity generator of hazardous waste or a TRI Form R reporter, those are the 2 groups that have to do it. And basically, you just estimate how much waste reduction you may have done. If you've implemented a pollution prevention project over that year, then you would enter that data into your report. It says I reduced my waste by X number of tons based on whatever pollution prevention project it was. And remember that your metrics can be based on a production ratio. So if you increased your production by 10%, but you kept your waste at the same level, that still means you had a 10% reduction in waste relative to your production ratio. So again, P2 planning report after all the others is like a piece of cake, but again, if you've got pollution prevention projects going, keep track of how much you've reduced in your metrics and report it. And I think that's it. W&M information if you want it, and here's my contact information if you want any more information. And I think there's one last really important poll question that lands.
I will go ahead and launch this one because I'm got money riding on it. So Super Bowl 51 winner, who you got? New England or the Falcons or the other ever popular commercials? I was almost going to put Lady Gaga in there, but then I said, I didn't want to be too controversial. So, but that should do it for us. Heather, thanks so much for all the great information. This is always one of the most popular webinars we have all year, and we had a full house today. So thank you again for your time.
And just for everybody that might be curious, 50% of the people roughly think that it's going to be the Atlanta Falcons, and then the other 50% is split between New England and the commercials.
All right. Well, our buddy Frank won't be very happy to hear about that. So, okay, just a reminder, I'm going to get this recording on the website here probably in about the next hour, and you can download the slides on the same site, and I will email you that link this afternoon. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.